Unless somebody has any questions on Hegelian dialectics. Cool. So, New Frontiers in Reason. To understand where Hegel is coming from, we have to understand what it is that Hegel is trying to overcome. The problem that Hegel has with Kantian metaphysics in the first place. To understand that, we're going to have to talk about correspondence theory. We're going to have to talk about the path of despair, as Hegel describes it, and how we get off of the path of despair. And then we're going to, again, talk about some of the consciousness and other concerns for this week's reading. When we look at this correspondence theory of truth, it's basically if my conscious understanding of the world, the ideas that I have about that state of affairs in the world, correspond with the actual state of affairs in the world, then we have correspondence, and we have truth. But if we remember from Hume's fork, this is kind of a problem because we don't have immediate experience of the world. We have a mediated experience of the world. So even though we believe that there's a real world there, and we believe that we have impressions of that real world, what we take away from that experience of the real world isn't the real world. What we take away is an idea that we have about it, or a relation of ideas. Right? So correspondence theory of truth doesn't actually do a good job of helping us overcome Hume's fork. So how do we come up with an idea of metaphysics? A constituted idea of metaphysics. If we remember Immanuel Kant's phrasing, the world is as it is because we constitute it thus. The faculties of our apprehension, the fact that we can do math is not something, it's not simply knowledge. It is knowledge, but this is knowledge that we use to apprehend the world. When we gain this kind of knowledge, this mathematical knowledge, when we gain the knowledge that cause and effect has a relationship, this knowledge then becomes faculties by which we apprehend the world. This brings us back to the problem of correspondence theory, because we still don't have access to that absolute objective world posed by Immanuel Kant. There's an objective world, an absolutely true world that informs our knowledge and our ideas. These knowledge and ideas we turn around and then use through the process of synthetic a priori knowledge, if you'll remember. We use the knowledge to synthesize new ideas, new ampliative knowledge about the truth that we find in the world. But this still doesn't help us understand the absoluteness of that world. We still have this mediatedness that we're going through. So some philosophers are going to take Immanuel Kant's metaphysics and apply Cartesian skepticism to it. And there's a lot of philosophy that happens in this vein, where we're being very skeptical systematically about everything that we possibly can doubt. And correspondence theory of truth is the best thing that we come up with in that line of reasoning. So correspondence theory is founded on the idea that there is a true external world, and our beliefs about the nature and properties of that world correspond with the objects of truth of the external world. We have certain knowledge. When there's correspondence between our ideas and the world itself, then we have correspondence, therefore that must be true. Here's the problem, as pointed out by Hegel, with this supposition. First off, when we're talking about what this external world ought to look like, we don't really know what it is that we're looking for. Also, attempts to better understand the tools or the faculties of apprehension by which we understand the world, we run into the same problem. we don't have direct access of the world. We have mediated access to the world. But when we look at those mediations, our senses, we find that when we turn our senses to our senses, we still don't know what it is that we're looking for or how to know when we found it. We don't have anything, any objective criteria to compare it with because we don't have objective access to knowledge. Skepticism offers no help. If we can be skeptical about the method by which we understand the faculties of our apprehension, then why should we trust that skepticism? Right? If we're trying to understand the world, but we can't because it's mediated through this thing, when we examine this thing, the apprehension, we're still using our faculty of apprehension. We can't get away from this problem. We're looking at, it's trying, an eyeball trying to see itself, right? And this is something that is not going to work. And all of the above, taken as granted that the self, apprehension, and truth are all separate and independent, which is something that we are going to have to get to, but we will have to shelve that for now and deal with this first, the Hegelian path of despair, which is where correspondence theory and Cartesian skepticism inevitably lead us. There's no way to avoid this path, according to Hegel. The exposition, the path of the natural consciousness, is a one-sided view from the perspective of the consciousness, which is founded upon the presupposition that there exists an absolute truth, or a truth which is absolute. Now, there's an awful lot going on here, so let's break this apart. So let's unpack this sentence. What does this mean? The exposition. Well, this is the consciousness, the natural consciousness, on its path out toward the external world, trying to understand the external world. This is what we'll call the exposition. And we have this impression, this idea that it's one directional. Descartes is going to say that it's the mind that goes out into the world. Remember, we talked about this, and makes ideas about the world. But all of those ideas are up here only. And John Locke said, well, no, it's the world. Properties of the world are impressed upon the mind. In either of these ways of thinking about it, the path is still only one direction. The state of despair, according to Hegel, is that is the thinking consciousness, the thinking mind, which is reaching out towards the external world, towards what it thinks is truth, absolute truth. Right? The consciousness believes that there's an absolute truth to be had out there. And this is what Hegel says, the path of despair. The realization that whether by dogma, a scientific authority, or by our own self-reliant truth, the unreal consciousness will always ultimately fail to acquire absolute knowledge. And from the reading, you'll remember Hegel references the abyss. Walking along this path, the exposition, and walking along the path, the exposition, we find ourselves against this great chasm of skepticism, where the apprehension apprehends something and says, yep, that's not it. And so we cast it into the abyss of uncertain knowledge. And then the faculties of our apprehension find something else, some other object to examine. And when it does, it says, yep, I can doubt that, and cast that too into the abyss. And this is a never-ending problem that we find when we're trying to come up with certain knowledge about the external world. If we take the route of skepticism, that is going to lead us down this path of despair, along the chasm of this abyss of nothingness, this uncertain knowledge, which is most knowledge is actually going to fit into this category, this great chasm of uncertainty. So what do we do? How do we fix this? Hegel says the fact that every time we pick something up and we cast it into the abyss, that is not us failing to find knowledge. That's us failing to recognize that we have found knowledge. Because we keep picking things up and then casting them into the abyss, that's our answer, is that everything that we pick up is going to be cast into the abyss. That's the truth. That's the knowledge that Hegel arrives on this path of despair, that there is a truth. There's one universal truth. There's one absolute truth. And that absolute truth is we don't have access to immediate experience of the world. The truth is skepticism will always fail to provide us a good answer about what that absolute world is and what that absolute world looks like. And that's okay. It doesn't matter, Hegel says, because we have something better. We have an answer, first off, that if we go down the road of skepticism, that's never going to give us anything certain other than we exist. I think, therefore I am. Congratulations, Descartes. That's all skepticism gets us. Everything else is now in this chasm of uncertain knowledge, and that's okay, Hegel says. Let's figure out where we go from there. It's not the case that my thinking consciousness only has a one-directional access to the world. In fact, I'm not separate from this apprehension, and that apprehension is not separate from me. It's all one. We've been trying to break these things up as though there's a self, a thinking mind, separate from the faculties of apprehension, separate from the external world. Hegel says that is never going to give us any real knowledge. We have knowledge of the world because we are in the world. We experience the world from within it. We don't view it from an external viewpoint. The external world is external to us, but we are not external to it. We are in the world. We experience the world as though we are in the world, not apart from it. We aren't objective. We can't have objectivity because we are in the world. We constitute the world, in fact. And so its constitution depends on our apprehension of it. So the whole thing is all one. The world, apprehension, and the constituting consciousness, which constitutes that external world. Which brings us to the process of synthesis. So let's think back to, I think it was week 2, where we talked about doxa, gnosis, and episteme. The example given by the textbook is that you're standing on a hill with your friend, and you feel a breeze on your face, and you say to your friend, "This breeze feels cold," and your friend says, "No, that breeze feels hot." This is doxa, and this presents some kind of paradox because both of these things can't be true at the same time, right? Hegel says, yes, both of those things are true. For each of you, both of those things are true at the same time, and it's not a paradox at all. That's just knowledge. And that's the only way that we can have knowledge, is within reference to our experience. But you might say, but we agree on some things. We all walk into a room and we see a table in the room. We all know that there's the table in the room. We all agree on it. That's not something that's up for debate. That's something that's real in the world, right? But then there's difficulty about figuring out what shape the color is, what shape the table is, what color the table is, how bright, depending on the angle, depending on the glare, depending on your relative location. The experience of that table is different for everyone who is in the room thinking about it. So how do we come up with truths about the table? This process of synthesis. So if I'm thinking of a dog. And now everybody who is here watching this live is now thinking about a dog. Think about a dog. Put the idea of a dog in your mind. And now everybody who is watching the recording later is all also thinking about a dog. We're all not thinking about the same dog. But what if we have to make a decision about what kind of dog we're talking about? What if we're all planning to buy a dog for the class? That would be fun, right? Let's have a class dog. What would that dog look like? What kind of dog would it be? Would it be friendly? Would it be cuddly? Would it be large? Would it be small? Would it have long hair? Would it have short hair? We would have to work together to come up with some idea about the kind of dog we all think is ideal. This is the process of dialectics, right? This is the process of you having an idea and me having an idea, and those ideas are different. Both of those ideas are true, but now we have to work together on something. So we have to synthesize those ideas into something that both of us understand. Because there are lots of conversations that you have on a regular basis where you don't sit down and clarify all of the details of all of the subjects, of all of the things that you've talked about in that conversation. So when you walk away, you each of you walk away with different truths about the same conversation that you both had. There's some synthesis, right? There's enough of that's similar between those two truths that you agree, that you have some idea about what's going on and what each of you means. But sometimes, as we all know, we make mistakes, or we misunderstand, or we don't agree on certain things, which is why we have to go through this constantly. The process of synthesis never ends. And it's important to remember we're talking about one's dialectical relationship with the world, right? So I have my own viewpoint, and everybody who has a different viewpoint is external to that. So there's a thesis and an antithesis, everybody else's conception of truth. And every moment of my existence, there's synthesis, because I am learning right now. I'm observing the world. I'm experiencing the world. I'm in it. And the synthesis from moment to moment looks very similar, right? But I have gone through transformative times in my life. I've had conversations where I've changed my mind. I've had experiences that have shifted my worldview dramatically. This is the process of individual synthesis in their dialectical relationship with the world. We also have this with others with whom we have relationships, right? The same kind of dialectical relationship where we have similar conceptions. They're not always the same, but we have to work together to accomplish certain things. So there's synthesis, again, from moment to moment between individuals. And those individuals are part of larger communities. People that you go to church with, people who you go to school with, people who you work with, these are different communities. And the relationship that you have with each of those communities is its own dialectical relationship, which is constantly forging out a new synthesis, a new truth, moment to moment. And all of those communities have relationships with other communities around them. The process goes up and up and up, and becomes very complicated very fast, because when we're talking about just one individual, you're thinking about everything that you have a relationship. Everything that you've ever experienced in your life is somewhat relational to you. Your past, your memories, all of those things that you remember, all of those old grudges, all of those happy memories that you have, all of those help you make decisions and are part of your synthesis process for one individual. And now we've got to take that and have that same conversation about two individuals and their relationships with each other, each informed by their own life experiences. So this becomes very complicated. This is what we call a plurality of truth, right? Because what is true for all of us to some degree. There is some universalness to this. The table is there. We agree that the table's there. We disagree about the qualities of the table, but at the end of the day, that doesn't matter. We can still all use the table. We can still make sense of the table. And this is how most of society functions, right? We don't always agree on how things ought to work or in how things actually do work, but they work nonetheless. We work through this process, and it's a deliberate process. Not everybody always thinks about how deliberate this process is, but you're constantly thinking. You're constantly having new ideas, and you're constantly synthesizing new truths, which is going to inform your new thesis, which then has to re-go through this process of dialectic relationship with the antithesis and synthesis over and over and over again, literally ad infinitum. Let's move me back over to here. So, a departure from Kant, Hegel argued that truth and reality are not static. The way that we view the world is determined by our history, language, and our society, right? Because when you're young, you learn how to learn. You don't learn how to learn in a vacuum. You learn how to learn from others, from doxa, if you remember, from common knowledge, from adages, from traditions, from institutions of schooling. These things are all handed down to you, and then you synthesize these into your faculties of apprehension. Your ability to make judgment becomes better, becomes more informed, becomes more adept at making judgments. So much so that you don't even think about it. You make judgments all the time and don't even think about it. And these judgments have been influenced by your personal history, by your schools, by your institutions, by your parents, by whatever religious affiliation you have. These things literally determine your ability to make judgments about the world as you're making judgments about the world. They don't purely determine it. You're not entirely determined because there's synthesis, right? The world presents you with this idea of truth and knowledge. You synthesize that as best you can and understand it as best you can and come up with a new thesis about the world, which is going to be met with new ideas from the world, which then requires a new dialectical process, right? So how we see the world is determined by our history, our language, and our society. These form the structural framework of our understanding. Truth never is. Truth is always becoming. And this final part is from the, most of the Hegel that we've talked about so far is from Phenomenology of Spirit. And then the last excerpt that you read from Hegel is from Reason and History, when Hegel's thought was a little bit more mature, a little bit more well-developed. And he has this idea of spirit, the human spirit, and that's not just my spirit, that's our spirit, the collective, all of us together form this human spirit, or the phenomenology of the human spirit. And this spirit is the result of principles, but also final purpose, which seems a little bit strange and esoteric, so let's unpack that. We have a world of rules. Some of those rules are metaphysical, right? I can't just will myself to fly. I have flesh, therefore I have to eat. These are natural processes of the natural world I can't do anything about. Some of the rules of the world are ones that are entirely human invention, right? Is Pluto a planet or isn't Pluto a planet? That's something that we determine, entirely up to us. And the decision that we make about Pluto doesn't change Pluto itself. Nothing metaphysically changed about Pluto when we decided to categorize it in a different way, or to think about it in a different way, or to put it into a different category, planet, not a planet. But that rule is a rule by which we live. And it has meaning because we give it meaning. We give it final purpose. We have some design for that category. We have some reason for wanting to make sense of the planet Pluto, right? So there's a telos built in. There's a final purpose built in. We can also think about this a little bit more abstractly, right? Driving on the right side of the road is an incoherent idea in a world where there aren't cars, right? That rule might exist in that world. That rule doesn't have any meaning. It doesn't have any purpose. It's just an aimless rule, right? Terminal velocity is incoherent where there are no falling objects. That idea, that rule, that metric by which we understand the world is incoherent. But when we apply these kinds of rules for understanding the world, and we apply that with some kind of purpose, some telos, something at which we are directed, that changes everything. That changes the meaning of existence. That changes how we understand existence. And it orients us in relation to the world such that we have designs and goals and our own telos in that world. That telos is in a lot of ways determined by our history and our language and our society, right? And so this is an ever repeating cycle. We'll talk about that a little bit more in depth when we get to phenomenology.